Say your name and where you're from.
Yeah, I'm Zainah Anwar, and I'm from Sisters in Islam in Malaysia.
Okay. Now, when we talk, you'll be looking directly at me as opposed to the camera. Okay. All right. So let's start out with the big broad question here in terms of talk a little bit about some of the challenges in terms of fighting violence against women in multi-ethnic societies, in particular ones ruled by religious law. What do you see first as the challenges, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we can effectively confront those challenges.
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges we faced when we were campaigning for a domestic violence law to make domestic violence a crime was the resistance and opposition from the religious authorities who say that this law cannot apply to Muslims because in Islam a man has a right to beat his wife, to discipline his wife. And so we had to confront that through various ways in terms of like public education, media strategies, and really coming out with research, to really, in fact, we came out with a question and answer booklet as part of this campaign. Do Muslim men have a right to beat their wives? And looking at the verse in the Quran, which has been commonly misinterpreted to say that a man has a right to beat his wife, and to challenge that within the context of revelation, within the fact that the prophet has never there's no record of the prophet advocating violence against women, or the prophet beating his wife or treating his wife badly. So we had to work, because the resistance to the law was coming from religion and the use of religion. We had to engage with the religious tradition as well to come out with an alternative position on this. But at the same time, we were working with other women's groups, so while we handled the specific issues of resistance from the religious authorities, they dealt with the negotiations, with the Attorney General's chambers and with others, building coalition, public education, having awareness raising programs and shopping complexes all over the country, getting women's voices who have been the victims of domestic violence to speak out about domestic violence, getting the media to report about this. So there were very multi-pronged strategies that were used.
Mm-hmm. In Malaysia, you need a minute, Kat? Yeah.
You know what? I'm sorry. I'm just going to have you stand up for 1 second so I can switch this cord underneath you. Oh, are you okay?
Yep.
Sorry about that.
All right. So, in Malaysia, you were successful in getting a domestic violence law passed. But what have been some of the problems with the implementation of that law, making it a reality?
Well, I mean, like many other traditional societies, there's always the gap between, de jure and de facto. So one is getting, the challenge, overcoming the challenge of getting a law passed to make domestic violence a crime. But just because a law has been passed does not mean that practice will automatically change with the law. It takes time for practice to change and for our attitudes to change. But, we felt it was very important that we at least have a legal framework that sets a standard, that beating up a woman is an offense and is a crime, and that you can be prosecuted for that. And so the cultural attitude change took a long time. We faced a challenge of the police. So we needed to deal with the police and educate the police, to accept reports from women, because there were many policemen who still think that this is a family matter. And so therefore, even though it's a crime, they don't want to enforce it. The women will go to them to report that the husband has beaten them, and they're told, go back. This is a family matter, you go back and solve it. So we had to, bring in actually the Canadian Royal Mounted Police to come in and to train the Malaysian police on, taking down, on understanding domestic violence and reporting domestic violence and taking down cases. So it took us a few years really of finally, being able to get the police to cooperate and do their work as they're supposed to do it. In taking out any woman who comes in to report domestic violence, you have to take the report. So that's a big challenge. Another challenge is the police then complain to us that they take the reports, and then when they want to prosecute the husbands, the women say, no, I withdraw my report. I don't want my husband to be prosecuted. So that's like another huge challenge. So we have to tell the police, well, just because the women wants to withdraw the report does not mean that you don't do your job in, taking down the report and following up, with the investigation, So the challenge of implementation, and the other issue as well, again, in negotiating for the Domestic Violence Act, everybody is so concerned about breaking up the family. Never mind the fact that the man who beats up his wife is already breaking up the family. But making domestic violence a crime is somehow seen as interfering in family matters and breaking up the family. Providing shelter for the women to enable the women to leave the home is like considered breaking up the family. So the government was very conscious about this kinds of opposition that's being raised by traditional figures about by men, and including members of parliament who were opposed to this legislation, saying that these are feminist groups that are pushing for alien Western values. This is breaking up the family and all that kind of arguments. So then the government, in drafting the law, the government put a clause that the woman cannot go to court and ask for an interim protection order on her own. She has to go to the welfare department and get a welfare officer to submit application for an interim protection order. So this takes the woman's empowerment away from her. She has to get state support in order to exercise her right under the law. And there are situations again, when welfare officers again say preserving the family is important, go back to your husband, and delays in applying for interim protection order. So since the implementation of the Act, we've been pushing for various kinds of amendments to the law. One is to enable the woman to apply directly for an interim protection order without first going to a welfare officer and getting the welfare, officer to do it. And I must say, now we don't really hear so much now about complaints from women that the police will not take their report. So, it's quite, it's become the norm now that police do take down the report. So it's important to have the law, even if there are shortcomings in the implementation of the law, because then, it sets a different standards, it educates the men. It's a slow process, but that education to change what is in the law to changing practices, at the ground level to the implementation of the law, that takes place. It takes time, but the change eventually comes. So that's really important, because the message is very clear out there now to men. If they beat up their wife, they are liable, to shame, to, police report lodged against you, to being prosecuted for domestic violence, So that's important, to set that standard that this is wrong.
What have you learned? What would you say are some of the best practices in advocating for the reform of laws dealing with violence against women?
I think the public education part of the work is extremely important, to build public support for such a legislation. So, we, JAG, the Joint Action Group for Gender Equality, spent, about 10 years really doing a roadshow on the issue of violence against women, all over the country in public places like shopping complexes and all that. So that's really important, kind of like to build the public voices and public support for such a law. The media strategy is also extremely important because, again, how do you educate the public, on an issue that traditionally is seen as that's a man's right. It's a family matter, and we're saying, no, it's not a family matter, it's a criminal matter. So there's a, change in the mindset, that we need to do. So using the media is extremely important, and I think we were very lucky in Malaysia because when we decided to campaign for the Domestic Violence Act, we already had a shelter for survivors of domestic violence. And so, therefore, we were able to get the women who had been in the shelter, who's also been counseled and empowered to speak out and to take action about their situation, to be able to speak to the press. So they were women who were willing to share the stories, willing to have the pictures of the injuries that they suffered at the hands of their husbands, for the pictures to be used in our public education work. So the real faces and real lives of women who have suffered domestic violence being out there in the public space, in the media, was extremely important in getting people and the policymakers to realize that this is a real issue, that women are suffering and discriminated against out there, and that something needs to be done. So I think that was also very important to get real life stories out there through the media.
Certainly in this battle all the way around, there are cultural and religious obstacles. In the non-Muslim communities as well, in Malaysia. What challenges do you see that are common, that are shared among the different?
It's violence. I think the collection of data was very important to show that this is an issue that doesn't affect just one community, the Muslim community or the Indian community, because there is this tendency to believe that, a stereotypical belief that because Indians drink, and in the alcoholic, in the drunken state, beat up their wives. So there is all these stereotypical views. Malaysia is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, so there are stereotypical views of Indian men who beat their wives because they're drunk. But the statistics show that this is a problem across all races and all classes of people. And this is really important to break the stereotypes. Sometimes it depends on where you gather the data. Like the Chinese data does not show up, say, in shelters for domestic violence victims, because the Chinese, because they're economically more empowered, they have other alternatives, to go. Places to go to, family support, better family support, other alternatives, economically independent, that they can, find an alternative housing, while the Indians who are poor and the Malays who are poor, go to the shelter. Or government hospitals. If you look at data just at government hospitals, of who go to government hospitals after being beaten up by the husbands, you tend to find that it is the Malays who go to government hospitals. So you think that it's a Malay problem, but it's not, So it really depends. Like, you have to be look at the data critically, to not jump to a conclusion that it's a Malay problem or an Indian problem. Because if you look at the phone calls that the support groups get, a huge percentage of the phone calls come from Chinese women. So you have to look at various data. So certainly the data shows that it is across ethnic groups, and it is not peculiar, to a particular ethnic group.
But can you share, in terms of the best approach in dealing with religious authorities on the subject of violence against women?
Well, I think engaging with them was very important. You know, the research that we did, you know, on the particular verse in the Quran that has been misused and misinterpreted to justify violence. You know, the research that we did from the Islamic perspective was very important in educating the public and educating the religious authorities that there are different ways of interpreting this verse. The context, you know, certainly Islam does not advocate for men to beat their wives, you know, using, like I said, the tradition of the Prophet, there was never any record of him beating his wife. So using that religious argument was very important in building public support and public awareness that we're not being bad Muslims by demanding that domestic violence, you know, is a crime, and engaging with the religious authorities as well, and shaming the government too was extremely important strategy, because even after the law was passed by Parliament, I mean, of course, there were many men who were in Parliament who were opposed to the law. So even after the law was passed, it took 2 more years before the law was finally gazetted and implemented. And one of the reasons was really because, again, that resistance from patriarchs saying that this is un-Islamic and it cannot apply to Muslims. And so we had worked very closely together with the women's groups, you know, that, you know, we want this law to apply to everyone. We do not want a law that only applies to non-Muslims. So the women's groups were united about ensuring that any law that is passed must apply to all citizens and not just to non-Muslims. So we really, like, you know, met with the Minister for Religion, with the Minister for Women, with the Attorney General's chambers, to really negotiate this. And to, in the end, I think the turning point was when on Women's Day, there was an international conference on gender studies in the universities, and the Minister for Women happened to open that conference, and JAG, the Joint Action Group for Gender Equality, actually demonstrated with posters and you know, demanding that Domestic Violence Act be implemented now. And that got us onto the front pages of the newspapers, and for the next few days we were just getting media stories out, getting women who have been in the shelter to speak out about the impact of domestic violence on their lives, on their children's lives, to really build up that pressure on the government. So in the end, you know, it was only after 2 years and that final, you know, event of the demonstration that the newspaper, so here again the media support was just so important. You know, 2 of the major mainstream newspapers put pictures of us on the front page and put the story on the front page of the newspapers, and that really put pressure on the government in the end, you know, to agree to implement, to gazette and implement the law, and for that law to apply to all citizens, Muslims and non-Muslims.
Childhood marriage, forcing children to marriage,
Yeah.
another issue that you've been involved with. What strategies within SIS have you been using to advocate, you know, to end that practice?
We've been asking for law reform. Actually, we never thought there was child marriage in Malaysia until we looked at the data, because HIV testing for Muslim couples intending to get married is compulsory in Malaysia. Then when Malaysia submitted its report to the UN General Assembly, you know, UNGAS on HIV/AIDS,
I'm
you know,
sorry.